A woman's lies. A black man's struggle. Kids caught in the middle. But nothing is as it seems in this shocking custody story. What would you do if the person who walked away from your life came back? Not to reconnect, but to take everything you hold dear. David Miller thought he'd lost everything when his wife, Angela, left him to raise their children alone. But now, in a courtroom filled with whispers and judgment, she's accusing him of being the absentee parent. As the truth unfolds, shocking revelations will turn this battle upside down. When the gavel falls, will justice prevail or will the lies win? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe.
Silence in the court!
The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 7B, casting harsh shadows across David Miller's composed features. His hands, calloused from years of carrying his children and building their lives, rested quietly on his lap. Across the room, Angela Reed sat with an air of practiced vulnerability, her designer clothes carefully selected to appear modest yet struggling. The mahogany panels of the courtroom seemed to absorb the tension, making the air thick and heavy. David's mind wandered to just that morning, making Liam's favorite dinosaur-shaped pancakes, helping Chloe perfect her ponytail for school, and promising them both that everything would be okay. The contrast between his warm, loving home and this sterile battlefield couldn't have been starker. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed, snapping David back to reality. Judge Harrison entered, his robes flowing behind him like a dark cloud. As everyone settled back into their seats, David caught Angela's performance beginning. A subtle trembling of her shoulders, a delicate dab at her eyes with a tissue she'd been holding ready. "Your Honor," Angela's lawyer began, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, "my client has endured years of struggling alone, carrying the burden of parenthood while Mr. Miller pursued his own interests." David's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Memories flooded his mind. Nights spent alone with the children, Angela's empty side of the bed growing colder with each passing month. He remembered Liam's 7th birthday party, where Angela had promised to show up but sent a text at the last minute about work commitments. The disappointment in his son's eyes that day still haunted him. Angela took the stand, and David watched as she transformed into someone he barely recognized. Gone was the woman who had once declared motherhood too constraining and disappeared for days without explanation. In her place sat a portrait of maternal sacrifice, complete with trembling lips and glistening eyes. "It was so hard," she testified, her voice catching at precisely the right moment. "I would work double shifts, trying to make ends meet, while David, he was always too busy with his career to help with the children." The jury leaned forward, captivated by her performance. David noticed one juror, a middle-aged woman, nodding sympathetically. He glanced at his lawyer, Sarah Chun, who remained unfazed, methodically taking notes. "There were nights," Angela continued, dabbing at her eyes, "when I would come home exhausted, and the children would be hungry because their father hadn't bothered to cook dinner." David's mind flashed to the countless meals he'd prepared, the bedtime stories he'd read, the homework he'd helped with, all while Angela's phone went straight to voicemail. He remembered the evening he'd found Chloe's college fund statement in the mail, but pushed the thought aside. That revelation would come later. As Angela wove her tale of maternal martyrdom, David noticed something subtle, a slight smirk playing at the corners of her mouth when she thought no one was watching. It was the same expression she'd worn when she told him she needed a break from all this domestic prison, leaving him to explain to their children why mommy wouldn't be home for dinner. Again, Sarah Chun leaned over, her whisper barely audible. "She's good. I'll give her that. But she's made a crucial mistake. She's underestimated you, David. And she's forgotten about the paper trail." David nodded slightly, his eyes never leaving Angela. He watched as she described a fictional weekend where she begged him to watch the children so she could pick up an extra shift at work. In reality, he'd spent that weekend taking Liam to his soccer tournament, while Chloe cheered from the sidelines. Angela's absence explained away with another convenient excuse. The judge's gavel crashed down, signaling a brief recess. As the courtroom began to empty, David caught Angela's eye. For a moment, her mask slipped, revealing a flash of the calculating woman beneath. She quickly recovered, turning away with another perfectly timed dab of her tissue. "Ready for cross-examination?" Sarah asked, gathering her notes. David took a deep breath, thinking of Liam and Chloe waiting at home with their grandmother, probably working on their homework at the kitchen table he built himself. "More than ready," he replied quietly. It's time they heard the truth. As the bailiff called everyone back to order, David straightened his tie, the one Chloe had picked out for him this morning, declaring it his lucky tie. He smiled inwardly, knowing that luck had nothing to do with what was about to unfold. The truth, methodically documented and carefully preserved, was about to have its day in court. The shadows in the courtroom seemed to deepen as Sarah Chan stood, ready to begin her cross-examination. Angela's confident smile faltered slightly as she caught the glint of determination in David's eyes. The real battle was about to begin. Spring 2010 painted the university campus in vibrant hues of cherry blossoms and fresh possibilities. David Miller sat under an ancient oak tree, his economics textbook balanced on his knee, color-coded notes spread around him like fallen leaves. His life had always followed a carefully plotted course: Dean's List, internship applications, and a 5-year career plan neatly typed and saved on his laptop. Then Angela Reed literally crashed into his world. "Oh God, I'm so sorry." Her voice carried on the warm breeze as her frisbee knocked his perfectly organized notes into disarray. She rushed over, her red hair wild and untamed, green eyes sparkling with mischief and apology. "I was aiming for Mark over there, but apparently I have the aim of a drunk penguin." David should have been annoyed. Instead, he found himself laughing, captivated by her infectious energy. "Well, I suppose my notes needed some spontaneous reorganizing anyway." "I'm Angela," she grinned, plopping down beside him without invitation. "And you're way too cute to be studying on a day like this." She grabbed his economics book, flipping through it with exaggerated horror. "Please tell me you're not one of those boring finance guys." "Accounting, actually," David smiled, expecting her to flee at the admission. Instead, she leaned closer. "Perfect. You can help me with my business math. I'm absolutely terrible at it, and in exchange, I'll teach you how to live a little." That was the beginning, a simple equation of opposites attracting. Their first date was typical David: dinner reservations at 7:30, movie at 9:45. Their second date was pure Angela: spontaneous road trip to a midnight beach concert, dancing in the surf until dawn. Somehow it worked. "You make me feel anchored," Angela told him one night, as they lay on the hood of his car watching meteors streak across the sky. "Like I won't just float away into the atmosphere." "And you make me feel like I can fly," he replied, pulling her closer. Their love story unfolded like a perfect symphony of contrasts. David's apartment, once a testament to minimalist organization, became brightened by Angela's scattered art supplies and impromptu dance parties. She dragged him to poetry slams and midnight markets. He taught her the satisfaction of a well-balanced checkbook and the joy of planning for tomorrow. The proposal was pure David, meticulously planned during a sunset hot air balloon ride. The wedding was pure Angela, barefoot on the beach, with flower crowns and fairy lights. They moved into their first home, a modest starter with good bones and better school districts. David saw their future there. Angela saw a canvas for adventure. Then came the blue line on the pregnancy test. "We're having a baby." David's joy was immediate and complete. He dove into preparation mode, researching the safest cribs, reading parenting books, planning the nursery. Angela smiled and nodded, but something flickered behind her eyes, a shadow of uncertainty that David, in his excitement, missed entirely. Liam arrived on a stormy Tuesday, 7 pounds of perfection with Angela's green eyes and David's serious expression. David fell in love instantly, marveling at tiny fingers and toes, already imagining future father-son moments. "He's so demanding," Angela whispered one night, as Liam's cries echoed through their home. David found her in the nursery, staring out the window instead of at their son. "I didn't know it would be like this. So constant." "We'll figure it out together," David assured her, taking the baby and settling into the rocking chair. Liam quieted immediately in his father's arms. Something crossed Angela's face, relief mixed with an emotion David couldn't quite identify. The months that followed were a blur of midnight feedings, first smiles, and the gradual transformation of their lives. David thrived in the routine of parenthood, finding joy in every milestone. He loved the structure of it all. The feeding schedules, the nap times, the predictable chaos of raising a child. But Angela seemed to fade, like a bright flower wilting in shade. She went through the motions of motherhood, but her eyes increasingly drifted to the windows, to the world beyond their domestic life. Her spontaneous adventures became less frequent, replaced by long silences and distant stares. One evening, David found her in their home office, surrounded by old photo albums. Pictures of their college days spread across the desk, Angela skydiving, both of them backpacking through Europe, countless moments of unplanned joy captured on film. "Remember when we were like this?" she asked, not looking up. Her finger traced their younger selves, frozen in a moment of carefree laughter. "We still are," David said, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt their hollowness. "Just different now. Better. Even." Angela didn't respond. She simply closed the album, but her hands lingered on its cover, like someone saying goodbye to an old friend. Outside, Liam's baby monitor crackled with soft coos, a reminder of their new reality. David watched as she walked past him, her shoulders slightly hunched, heading toward their son's room. But he noticed she took a detour, pausing at their bedroom window to stare at the setting sun, her silhouette rimmed in gold like a bird poised for flight. In that moment, standing in the growing shadows of their home, David felt the first real tremor of fear for their future. It wasn't the crying baby or the sleepless nights that threatened their happiness. It was the growing distance in Angela's eyes, the way she looked at their carefully built life as if it were a beautiful cage. The sound of Liam's laughter drifted up from the nursery, and David turned toward it, drawn by the magnetic pull of fatherhood. Behind him, Angela remained at the window, her reflection growing fainter as darkness fell, until she was just a shadow against the dying light. The first signs appeared like hairline fractures in fine china, barely visible but irreparable once they started spreading. David noticed them in the little things. Dinner plates growing cold on the table, bedtime stories told solo, and the increasing silence in their once lively home. Chloe had joined their family 2 years after Liam, completing what David thought was their perfect quartet. While he saw their children as life's greatest blessing, Angela seemed to view them as anchors, weighing her down in an ocean of responsibility she never wanted to navigate. "The kids asked about you at bedtime again," David said one evening as Angela walked through the door well past 9. The scent of unfamiliar perfume and wine clung to her clothes. "Chloe wouldn't sleep until I promised you'd be here for breakfast." Angela's response was a dismissive wave as she dropped her keys on the counter. "I had a work thing. You know how it is." But David did know. He'd called her office earlier, only to learn she'd left at 5. Their conversations became a minefield of unspoken accusations and half-truths. David watched as Angela transformed their home into a way station, a place to briefly touch down between increasingly frequent absences. The calendar on their kitchen wall told the story in stark relief. Dance recitals marked with only his initials, parent-teacher conferences attended solo, family dinners becoming a trio instead of a quartet. "You're suffocating me with all these expectations." Angela exploded one Sunday morning when David suggested they take the kids to the park. "It's always schedules and plans and responsibilities with you. When did you become so boring?" The words stung, but it was the look in her eyes that hurt more, a mixture of contempt and restlessness that made David feel like a jailer rather than a husband. "These expectations are called being parents, Angela. Our children need stability." "Well, maybe I need something else." She stormed out, leaving David to explain to Liam and Chloe why their park day had turned into another disappointment. The late nights became more frequent. Sometimes she'd call with excuses, drinks with colleagues, networking events, yoga classes that mysteriously ran hours long. Other times, silence was her only response to David's increasingly worried texts. Then came the night that changed everything. It started like any other Tuesday. David helped Liam with his math homework while Chloe practiced her reading, the routine as familiar as breathing. But as evening stretched into night, Angela's absence became a heavy presence in their home. 9 p.m. No response to his texts. 10 p.m. Straight to voicemail. 11 p.m. Still no word. David paced the living room, his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The house creaked with familiar night sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft breathing of their children upstairs, the ticking clock marking each moment of Angela's absence. He called hospitals, then her friends, then her office again. Each dead end increased the knot in his stomach. The rational part of his mind suggested sleep, but worry kept him awake, watching headlights sweep across their living room walls, none belonging to Angela's car. At 3:47 a.m., the front door finally opened. Angela stumbled in, her high heels dangling from one hand, lipstick slightly smeared. The sight of David waiting up seemed to surprise her, as if his concern was an inconvenience she hadn't anticipated. "Where were you?" His voice was quiet, controlled, though his hands shook slightly. "I've been calling all night. The kids were worried sick." Angela's laugh was hollow, echoing in the pre-dawn silence. "Oh, David, always the concerned father. Always so perfect, so responsible." She dropped her shoes with a clatter that seemed too loud in the sleeping house. "I was out living, if you must know." "Remember living? Before schedules and soccer practice and PTA meetings?" "Our children were worried," David repeated, his voice tightening. "I was worried. You couldn't even send a text? You've got everything under control here, don't you?" Her words dripped with sarcasm as she gestured around their home, at the family photos, the children's artwork, the carefully maintained order of their lives. "Super Dad, handling it all. Maybe you don't need me at all." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. David stared at this woman who wore his wife's face but spoke with a stranger's voice. In that moment, he saw their future splintering into before and after, like a photograph torn down the middle. "Mom?" Liam's small voice came from the stairs, and both adults turned to see their son standing there in his dinosaur pajamas, confusion written across his sleepy face. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," David said gently, already moving toward the stairs. "Everything's fine." As he guided Liam back to his room, he heard the master bedroom door slam, shut behind Angela. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, marking another crack in their foundation, another step toward the inevitable collapse. Later, lying awake in the guest room, David stared at the ceiling and realized something that sent a chill through his heart. Angela's words hadn't sounded like a complaint. They had sounded like a plan. The morning would bring forced normalcy, breakfast preparations, school lunches, rushed goodbyes. But in the pre-dawn darkness, David finally admitted to himself what he'd been denying for months. The woman he married was disappearing, not in dramatic exits but in small abandonments, each absence carving away at their family's foundation until nothing would be left but memories and empty spaces where love used to live. The day Angela left wasn't marked by thunder or dramatic scenes. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in October, unremarkable except for how it would divide their lives into before and after. David was making breakfast, whole wheat pancakes shaped like hearts for Chloe, dinosaur eggs oatmeal for Liam. When Angela appeared in the kitchen doorway, a sleek suitcase at her feet, the sight of that luggage, packed in secret while he slept, would haunt his dreams for months to come. "I need space," she announced, her voice eerily calm, as if discussing a weekend getaway rather than abandoning her family. "This whole domestic thing, it's suffocating me. I need a break from being a mom." The spatula in David's hand froze mid-flip. Upstairs, he could hear Chloe singing in the shower, Liam's footsteps thundering across the hallway, the ordinary symphony of their morning routine suddenly feeling precious and fragile. "A break?" he repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "From being a mom? Angela, that's not something you can just pause." She shrugged, the gesture so casual it felt like a physical blow. "You'll be fine. You're better at this than I ever was anyway." Her eyes swept over the kitchen, the lunch boxes David was preparing, the weekly schedule magnetized to the fridge, the pile of permission slips waiting for signatures. They barely need me anymore. They're your children, David's voice cracked slightly. They'll always need their mother. Mom, Chloe's voice floated down the stairs. Can you help me with my hair? I want it like Emma's from dance class. Angela's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Without responding to their daughter, she grabbed her suitcase handle. I'll call when I'm settled. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, David. And just like that, she was gone, leaving David to navigate the aftermath of her departure like a captain steering through a storm. The hardest part wasn't managing the logistics, it was answering the questions that followed. When is Mom coming back? Liam asked that night, pushing his dinner around his plate. She just needs some time, David replied, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. But I'm here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere. Days blurred into weeks as David reconstructed their lives around Angela's absence. He learned through necessity and determination, YouTube tutorials for French braiding Chloe's hair, late-night practice sessions until his fingers could weave the strands perfectly. He memorized Liam's soccer schedule, coordinated with other parents for carpools, and mastered the art of being in two places at once. His boss, understanding the situation, allowed him to work flexible hours. David would arrive early, power through his accounting work, and leave in time for school pickup. Evenings became a carefully choreographed routine of homework help, dinner preparation, and quality time. Daddy, Chloe said one night as he tucked her in, you make the best princess braids now. Her small hand touched his cheek, and David had to swallow hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. Angela's visits were sporadic and unsettling. She'd appear unannounced, bearing expensive gifts and tales of her amazing new life, then disappear again, leaving emotional chaos in her wake. The children would be unsettled for days afterward, their routine disrupted by her brief returns to their orbit. Why doesn't Mom stay anymore? Liam asked after one such visit, his young face serious. Is it because of us? David pulled his son close, fighting back tears. No, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense, but it's never because of you or Chloe. You are both perfect exactly as you are. Slowly, they found their new normal. David discovered strength he never knew he had, learning to be both mother and father, counselor and confidant, provider and protector. The children, resilient in ways that amazed him, began to thrive despite their mother's absence. Chloe's dance recital came and went, her performance dedicated to "My Daddy Who Learned to Do Hair." Liam scored his first soccer goal, his eyes searching the crowd only for his father's proud face. Their home, once echoing with the silence of Angela's departure, filled instead with laughter, music, and the warm chaos of family life. Then, 6 months after she left, Angela reappeared. This time, she wasn't alone. David opened the door one evening to find her standing there with a man in an expensive suit. Her lawyer, as it turned out. The sight of legal papers in their hands made his blood run cold. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Angela announced, her voice carrying that same casual tone she'd used the day she left. I want custody of the kids. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Behind him, David could hear Chloe practicing piano, Liam's video game beeping softly from the living room. The peaceful evening routine he'd worked so hard to establish suddenly threatened by this new storm. You left them, he said quietly, his hand gripping the door frame. You walked away. Angela's smile was sharp and unfamiliar. I took a break to find myself. Now I'm ready to be a mother again. She held out the papers. Don't make this difficult, David. You know how these things usually go. Courts favor mothers. As David stared at the custody papers, he felt something shift inside him. The quiet, accommodating man who had watched his wife walk away was gone. In his place stood a father who would fight with everything he had to protect the stability and love he'd built for his children. You're right about one thing, he said, his voice steady despite the thunder of his heart. I do know how these things go. I have 6 months of documentation showing exactly what kind of mother you choose to be. Angela's confident smile faltered slightly, but her lawyer stepped forward. We'll be in touch, Mr. Miller. Do consider what's best for the children. As they walked away, David closed the door and leaned against it, taking deep breaths. From the living room, he heard Liam call out, "Dad, want to play this level with me?" Straightening his shoulders, David moved toward his son's voice, toward the life he'd rebuilt from the ashes of Angela's departure. The custody papers felt heavy in his hand, but his resolve was stronger. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, he wouldn't be silent. The courthouse air conditioning hummed like a distant beehive, its steady drone a counterpoint to the emotional theater unfolding in courtroom 7B. David sat at the defendant's table, his ties suddenly feeling too tight as Angela took the stand, the picture of maternal grace in her modest blue dress. "Mrs. I needed help, but David was always too busy. I had to step away temporarily for my mental health to become a better mother for them." David's mind flashed to reality. The nights he'd cooked dinner while helping with homework, the weekends filled with soccer games and dance recitals, the careful financial records showing Angela's declining contributions to their children's lives. But here in the courtroom, truth seemed to bow before theater. "And now," her lawyer continued, "why are you seeking custody?" "I'm stronger now," Angela declared, sitting straighter. "I can provide the stable, nurturing environment they need." "David? He means well, but children need their mother. It's not natural for a father to be the primary caregiver." The last statement hung in the air like poison gas. David felt the weight of generations of prejudice pressing down on him. Even the judge, despite his professional neutrality, seemed swayed by the deeply ingrained belief that mothers were the natural custodians of children. During the brief recess, Maria led David to a private conference room. "Don't let her performance shake you," she said, spreading documents across the table. "We have something she doesn't evidence." David picked up a stack of school attendance records, his signature on every parent-teacher conference form. "But they believe her, Maria. You saw their faces." "They believe what they expect to believe," Maria replied, her dark eyes fierce. "Society has trained them to see mothers as natural caregivers and fathers as secondary parents. But we're going to shatter that perception." She pulled out more documents, financial records showing Angela's declining contributions, text messages documenting her missed commitments, testimonials from teachers about David's consistent involvement in his children's education. "This isn't just your custody battle, David," Maria continued, organizing the evidence into neat piles. "This is about challenging a system that automatically assumes mothers are better parents. Your case could help other fathers fighting the same fight." Back in the courtroom, Angela's cross-examination began. Their smiles, their trust, their love, these were the real evidence of his parenting, more powerful than any courtroom testimony. Tomorrow would bring another day of battle, but tonight, he would help with homework, make dinner, and read bedtime stories. Because regardless of society's expectations or Angela's performance, this was what being a parent truly meant, showing up every day with unwavering love and dedication. The custody papers sat heavy in his briefcase, but his children's laughter was lighter than air, carrying him forward into whatever challenges tomorrow would bring. The wooden witness stand creaked softly as David settled into place. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth, though truth had seemed a fragile thing in this courtroom lately. "Mr. Miller," Maria began, her voice steady and clear, "please tell the court about a typical day in your household." David took a deep breath, his mind traveling to just yesterday morning. "I wake up at 5:30 a.m. to prepare for the day. Liam needs his lunch packed specifically. He's particular about his sandwiches being cut diagonally. Chloe has dance practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so those mornings require extra preparation." As he spoke, his voice grew stronger. This wasn't just testimony. These were the threads of love that wove through every day of his life. "By 6:45, I'm getting the kids up. Chloe needs help with her hair. I learned to braid watching YouTube tutorials after Angela left. Liam takes longer with breakfast, so we start him first. We have a morning routine: breakfast, teeth brushing, backpack check. I've made it into a game to keep them engaged." Maria nodded encouragingly. "And after school? I arrange my work schedule to be there for pickup at 3:15. Homework comes first. Liam struggles with math, so we spend extra time there. Chloe reads to me while I prepare dinner. We eat together every night, No phones allowed. It's our time to connect, to share our days. The jury watched intently as David described the intricate choreography of single parenthood. Gone was the stereotype of the bumbling father. In its place sat a man who could discuss parent-teacher conferences with the same expertise as he could detail his daughter's favorite bedtime stories. Maria approached with a thick folder. I'd like to enter these documents into evidence, Your Honor. School records showing Mr. Miller's attendance at every parent-teacher conference for the past year. Medical records documenting his presence at all appointments. Financial statements demonstrating consistent support of his children's activities and needs. The papers passed through the judge's hands, each page adding weight to David's testimony. Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat as her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. Mr. Miller, Maria continued, could you tell us about the children's college funds? I established savings accounts for both children when they were born, David explained. Every month, I contribute a fixed amount. These accounts were meant to secure their future education. Were meant to? Yes, David's voice tightened. Until I discovered unauthorized withdrawals began shortly before Angela left. The courtroom stirred. Angela's lawyer stood to object, but Maria was already moving on, laying groundwork for revelations yet to come. Your Honor, Maria announced, I'd like to call an unexpected witness, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, the Millers' next-door neighbor for the past 6 years. Angela's composed facade cracked visibly as Sarah Thompson entered the courtroom. A retired school teacher with silver hair and kind eyes, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen much and judged little. Mrs. Thompson, Maria began after the preliminary questions. Could you describe your observations of the Miller family over the past few years? Of course, Sarah nodded, her voice clear and steady. I've watched those children grow up. David, Mr. Miller, he's been their rock. Every morning, I'd see him helping them into the car for school, always on time, always prepared. In the evenings, they'd be in the backyard. Homework on nice days, playing games, or just talking. And Mrs. Reed? Sarah's expression softened with something like pity. She was less present. There were many nights I'd see her car leave late, return in the early morning hours. Sometimes she'd be gone for days. The children would stand at the window, watching for her, but David would always find ways to distract them, to protect them from disappointment. Angela's lawyer stood. Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay and speculation. Mrs. Thompson, the judge intervened. Please stick to direct observations. Very well, Sarah continued. Last summer, during the neighborhood block party, Chloe fell and scraped her knee badly. Angela was there, for once, but she was busy talking with friends. It was David who noticed immediately, who cleaned the wound and comforted Chloe. It's always been David. The jury members exchanged glances. A young mother in the front row wiped her eyes discreetly. One more thing, Sarah added, her voice catching slightly. The night Angela left, I was watering my plants when I saw her loading her car. The children were asleep, but David was awake. He stood in the doorway, asking her to reconsider, to think about the kids. She just drove away. But the next morning, David was there, making breakfast, getting them ready for school, being both mother and father because that's what his children needed. The courtroom fell silent. David caught Angela's eye across the room. Her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling thread by thread. Maria approached the bench with another document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Mrs. Thompson's detailed journal, recording dates and times of Mrs. Reed's absences over the past 2 years. Angela's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is prejudicial. Overruled, the judge declared, accepting the journal. The witness's contemporary records are admissible. As Sarah Thompson stepped down, David felt the atmosphere in the courtroom shift. The truth was emerging, not in dramatic revelations but in the steady accumulation of daily moments. School forms signed, dinners cooked, wounds bandaged, promises kept. Angela's confident smile had disappeared entirely now, replaced by a tightness around her eyes as she whispered frantically to her lawyer. The jury members were reviewing their notes, several nodding thoughtfully as they connected the dots between David's testimony and the mounting evidence. But the day's revelations weren't over. Maria had saved her most compelling evidence for last, evidence that would shake the very foundation of Angela's custody claim. As she prepared to present it, David caught a glimpse of hope in the judge's thoughtful expression. The truth was finally having its day in court. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor as Maria approached the bench with a new set of documents. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step measured and purposeful. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to present evidence regarding the children's college savings accounts established by Mr. Miller shortly after each child's birth." David watched as the color drained from Angela's face. Her lawyer leaned forward, suddenly alert, as if sensing the shift in the air. "These accounts," Maria continued, distributing copies to the judge and jury, "were meant to secure Liam and Chloe's educational future. Mr. Miller contributed $500 monthly to each account since their inception." She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "That is, until unusual activity began approximately 8 months ago." The financial statements projected onto the courtroom screen told their own story. Regular deposits from David's salary, steady growth over years, and then a pattern of withdrawals, each one larger than the last. On March 15th, Maria's voice cut through the silence, $15,000 withdrawn. April 3rd, $12,000. May 21st, $20,000. All authorized by Mrs. Reed's signature, all transferred to a personal account in her name. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. A juror in the front row shook his head, making careful notes. "Mrs. Reed," Maria turned to face Angela directly, "could you explain these withdrawals?" Angela's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. My client hasn't been called to testify." "Your Honor," Maria interrupted smoothly, "Mrs. Reed's signature is on these withdrawal slips. She has direct knowledge of these transactions." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Mrs. Reed, please answer the question." Angela shifted in her seat, her carefully constructed poise crumbling. I needed the money for investments, for the children's future." "Investments?" Maria's eyebrow arched. "Could you be more specific?" "Personal investments," Angela's lawyer interjected, but his intervention came too late. "Like the down payment on your new Mercedes?" Maria produced another document. "Or perhaps the lease on your luxury apartment. Or maybe," she paused, delivering the final blow, "the couple's retreat to Bali with Mr. James Peterson?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Angela's face flushed deep red as her lawyer frantically whispered in her ear. "Your Honor," the lawyer stood, his voice strained. "My client was merely trying to establish herself to provide a better life for her children." "A better life?" David's voice cut through the chaos, steady and clear. "Our children's future security was in those accounts. Every birthday check from grandparents, every holiday gift, every extra penny I could spare, all saved for their education. And you spent it on vacations?" The jury watched as Angela's composure completely shattered. "You don't understand," she burst out. "I deserved some happiness. All those years of domestic drudgery, watching you play the perfect father while I felt trapped." Her lawyer grabbed her arm, trying to silence her, but Angela was beyond control now. "Do you know how hard it is to maintain appearances?" she continued, her voice rising hysterically. "The right clothes, the right car, the right address, it all costs money. I couldn't go back to living like some ordinary housewife." The silence that followed was deafening. Angela's lawyer closed his eyes in defeat, knowing his client had just revealed her true priorities to the entire court. Maria approached the bench one final time. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence." She produced a series of credit card statements. "These show Mrs. Reed's spending patterns over the past year. Note the charges for luxury boutiques, high-end restaurants, and spa treatments, all while she claimed she couldn't afford child support payments." The judge studied the documents carefully, his expression grave. "Mrs. Reed's lawyer, do you wish to respond to this evidence?" The lawyer stood slowly, his earlier confidence evaporated. "Your Honor," While my client's actions might seem impulsive, they don't negate her maternal rights. Maternal rights? David interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. Is that what you call emptying your children's college funds for spa days and vacation flings? The jury forewoman was openly glaring at Angela now. Another juror, a father of 3, shook his head in disgust. Furthermore, Maria continued, I'd like to enter into evidence Mrs. Reed's recent loan applications, where she listed herself as single with no dependents to qualify for better terms. Documents signed while simultaneously pursuing this custody battle. Angela's lawyer slumped in his chair, knowing the case was imploding. His client had just demonstrated, more clearly than any evidence could show, where her priorities truly lay. David sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. He thought of Liam's dreams of becoming a veterinarian, of Chloe's plans to study dance, dreams that had been partially funded by those savings accounts. The anger he felt wasn't for himself, but for his children's compromised futures. Your Honor, Maria concluded, the evidence clearly shows that while Mr. Miller has dedicated himself to providing a stable, nurturing environment for his children, Mrs. Reed has consistently prioritized her personal desires over their well-being. The financial records tell only part of the story. The real evidence lies in the choices these parents have made. As the judge called for a brief recess, David caught sight of Angela's face. For the first time, he saw not his former wife or even his children's mother, but a stranger who had chosen self-interest over family. The revelation brought no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for what their children had lost. But as he gathered his papers, David's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson. Liam just got an A on his math test. Chloe can't wait to show you her new dance routine. They're both asking when Daddy's coming home. Despite everything, David smiled. The truth had finally emerged, not just about the money, but about what truly makes a parent. As he prepared for the final phase of the trial, he knew that regardless of the outcome, his children would always know one thing for certain. Their father's love was something that could never be withdrawn. Judge William Harrison had presided over hundreds of custody battles in his 15 years on the bench. Each case left its mark, but none had challenged his preconceptions quite like this one. As he sat in his chambers during the recess, his weathered hands resting on the Miller case file, he found himself confronting his own biases. When the case first crossed his desk, he'd made assumptions. A father seeking primary custody usually meant an opportunistic attempt to avoid child support or a vindictive move against the mother. He'd seen it before, or thought he had. Now, surrounded by the evidence presented over the past days, those assumptions felt like shadows dissolving in harsh daylight. The bailiff's knock interrupted his reflection. They're ready for you, Your Honor. Rising from his chair, Judge Harrison caught his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him seemed older, wiser perhaps, than it had been when this trial began. He straightened his robes and returned to the courtroom. The tension was palpable as he took his seat. David sat straight-backed at his table, his tie slightly askew. Probably from helping Chloe with her homework during the lunch break, the judge realized, remembering the young girl's math papers he'd glimpsed earlier. Angela, in contrast, sat with perfect posture, her appearance immaculate but her eyes betraying a growing unease. Before we proceed, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. I feel compelled to address something. He removed his glasses, a gesture that made the formal proceedings suddenly more personal. In my years on this bench, I've seen countless custody battles, and I must confess, I've carried certain presumptions into this courtroom. Presumptions about mothers and fathers, about their roles and capabilities. The courtroom held its breath. Such candor from the bench was rare. 28 years ago, he continued, his voice softening, I was in a situation not unlike yours, Mr. Miller. All eyes turned to the judge as he shared something he'd never spoken of in court before. My wife left when our daughters were 4 and 6. In those days, it was almost unheard of for a father to get custody. The system, society, everyone assumed children belonged with their mother. I fought anyway. He paused, the memory still sharp after all these years. I lost that battle, not because I was an unfit parent, but because the system wasn't ready to see fathers as primary caregivers. My daughters spent years shuttling between homes, watching their mother's parade of new boyfriends, while I was relegated to weekend visits. Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the judge continued. Last month, my eldest daughter called me. She's a family court judge now in Seattle. She told me something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. She said, "Dad, I became a judge because I watched you fight a system that wasn't fair, and I wanted to help change it." The judge put his glasses back on, his judicial demeanor returning. This court has seen evidence that goes beyond paperwork and bank statements. We've seen the daily commitment of a father who learned to braid hair, who balances work meetings with soccer practices, who puts his children's future ahead of his own comfort. He turned to face Angela directly. And we've seen evidence of choices made that prioritized personal pleasure over parental responsibility. The college funds that were meant to secure futures were instead used to secure luxury. Angela's lawyers started to rise, but the judge held up his hand. "I'm not finished. The law requires us to act in the best interest of the children. For too long, we've allowed societal prejudices to define those interests. We assume that mother knows best without examining the evidence before us. Today, we have that evidence." The judge lifted a stack of papers, school records, financial statements, witness testimonies. These documents tell a story, but not the one I expected when this trial began. They tell of a father who stepped up when his children needed him most, who created stability from chaos, who put aside his own pain to protect his children from theirs. David felt tears pricking at his eyes as the judge continued. "But before I make my final ruling, there's something else we need to address." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression grave. "This case represents more than one family's struggle. It represents a moment when we must decide if we will continue to be bound by outdated prejudices or if we will have the courage to see the truth before us." He paused, looking directly at the jury. The question before this court isn't simply about custody. It's about whether we can overcome our biases to recognize genuine parental dedication, regardless of gender. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffle of papers had ceased. "I'm calling a brief recess," the judge announced. "When we return, I will deliver my ruling. But I want everyone in this courtroom to use these minutes to examine their own prejudices, as I have examined mine. Justice isn't about following precedent blindly. It's about having the courage to set new precedents when the old ones no longer serve truth." As the bailiff called, "All rise," David caught the judge's eye for a moment. In that brief exchange, he saw something he hadn't expected: understanding, respect, and perhaps a glimpse of the father who had fought his own battles so many years ago. The recess bell sounded, but few people moved. The weight of the judge's words held them in place, each person lost in thought about their own assumptions and biases. The next few minutes would change not just one family's future, but potentially the way society viewed fathers in custody battles. David pulled out his phone, looking at his background photo, Liam and Chloe at the park last weekend, their faces bright with laughter. Whatever came next, he knew he had already won the most important battle, being the father his children deserved. The clock ticked toward the moment of truth, and the courtroom waited, holding its collective breath for a decision that would ripple far beyond these walls. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courtroom windows as Judge Harrison returned to the bench. The room fell silent, the air heavy with anticipation. David's heart thundered in his chest as he stood, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders. "Be seated," Judge Harrison commanded, adjusting his reading glasses. His expression was solemn as he began to speak. "In the matter of Miller versus Reed, regarding the custody of minor children Liam Miller and Chloe Miller, this court has carefully considered all evidence presented." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "What we have witnessed in this courtroom goes beyond a simple custody dispute. We have seen the unraveling of a carefully constructed narrative, one that played upon societal prejudices and presumptions." David felt Maria's reassuring hand on his arm as the judge continued. "Mrs. Reed, your testimony and actions have demonstrated a disturbing pattern of deception and self-interest. The misappropriation of your children's college funds, the fabricated stories of domestic hardship, And the manipulation of this court's traditional biases are not just disappointing, they are reprehensible. Angela sat stone-faced, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the armrests of her chair. Mr. Miller, the judge turned to David. You have shown this court what true parenting looks like. Through documented evidence, witness testimony, and your own actions, you have demonstrated an unwavering commitment to your children's well-being. You have maintained their stability, protected their interests, and put their needs above your own. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that full legal and physical custody of Liam and Chloe Miller be granted to their father, David Miller. The words hung in the air like suspended crystal, beautiful and sharp. David closed his eyes, feeling tears of relief threatening to fall. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone hardening, Mrs. Reed will be required to make full restitution of all funds withdrawn from the children's college accounts, with interest. Visitation rights will be supervised and contingent upon completion of parenting classes and financial responsibility counseling. The judge's gavel cracked through the air, making it official. This court is adjourned. The room erupted in muted conversation as people began to move. David turned to hug Maria, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for everything. You did this, David, she smiled, gathering her papers. You fought for your children when it would have been easier to give up. Across the room, Angela stood slowly, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't look at David as she walked past, her heels clicking against the floor like ice cracking. Her lawyer trailed behind, looking defeated and avoiding eye contact. As David gathered his belongings, still processing the reality of his victory, Maria touched his arm. David, wait. She held out a cream-colored envelope. The bailiff just handed me this. It's from Angela. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, despite containing only a single sheet of paper. David unfolded it, reading the neat, familiar handwriting. Asterisk, you may have won their custody, but you haven't won the war. Remember, children can be very impressionable, and memories are fragile things. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Asterisk. David's hands trembled slightly as he handed the note to Maria, who read it quickly, her expression darkening. This is a threat, David. We should file it with the court. No, David interrupted, surprising himself with his calmness. File it away, but don't act on it yet. She's trying to provoke a reaction, to keep the battle going. My kids need peace, not another round of legal warfare. Maria nodded reluctantly, tucking the note into her briefcase. Just be careful, David. Sometimes people are most dangerous when they've lost everything. As they walked out of the courthouse together, the late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. David's phone buzzed, a text from Mrs. Thompson. The kids are bursting to know how it went. They've made you a winner, Dad banner. Despite Angela's threatening note, David smiled. He had fought not just for custody, but for the right to be seen as a capable, loving parent. The system's bias had been challenged and overcome. Yet as he descended the courthouse steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that this victory, however sweet, might be just the beginning of a new chapter in their story. Ready to go home? Maria asked, sensing his thoughtful mood. More than ready, David replied, thinking of the homework help, dinner preparations, and bedtime stories that awaited him. These ordinary moments, the ones Angela had dismissed as beneath her, were the true treasures of parenthood. As he drove home, the setting sun in his rearview mirror, David thought about Angela's note. She might not have given up, but neither had he. He had fought the system's prejudices and won. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that had brought him this far. The Winner Dad banner would go up on his wall, not as a trophy of victory over Angela, but as a reminder that sometimes the biggest wins come from simply showing up, day after day, for the people who matter most. The familiar crunch of gravel under David's tires announced his arrival home. Before he could even turn off the engine, the front door burst open, releasing two streaks of motion that resolved into Liam and Chloe racing down the path. Daddy! Daddy! Chloe's voice carried across the yard, her pigtails bouncing with each step. Liam, trying to maintain his 11-year-old dignity, walked faster rather than ran, but his face betrayed the same eager anticipation. David stepped out of the car just in time to catch Chloe as she launched herself into his arms. The force of her embrace knocked his tie askew, but he didn't care. Liam joined them, wrapping his arms around David's waist, his facade of preteen coolness forgotten. "We made you something," Chloe announced, tugging at his sleeve. Above the front door hung a hand-painted banner, slightly crooked but perfect in its imperfection. "World's Best Dad" written in rainbow colors, with handprints serving as exclamation points. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "They've been working on it all afternoon," she smiled. Barely touched their snacks, they were so focused. David carried Chloe inside, Liam still clinging to his side. The house smelled of chocolate chip cookies, Mrs. Thompson's specialty, and something else, something that had been missing during the trial: peace. "Did you win, Dad?" Liam asked quietly as they settled on the living room couch. "Are we staying with you?" David pulled both children closer. "Yes," he said simply. "We're staying together. Nothing's going to change that." Chloe looked up at him with serious eyes. "What about Mommy?" David chose his words carefully. "Your mom can still visit you, but this will be your home, and I'll always be here for you, just like I've always been. Promise?" Liam's voice carried a hint of vulnerability that made David's heart ache. "Promise." David held out his pinky finger, and both children linked theirs with their sacred family gesture that meant absolute truth. After Mrs. Thompson left, they spent the evening together, just the three of them. They ordered pizza, a special occasion break from their usual healthy dinner routine, and sat on the floor around the coffee table, sharing stories and dreams. "Dad," Liam said between bites, "can we still go camping next month? Like we planned?" "Of course we can, buddy. The tent's already in the garage." "And my dance recital?" Chloe piped up. "You'll be there?" David touched her nose gently. "Front row, just like always." As the evening wore on, they fell into their familiar bedtime routine. David helped Chloe arrange her stuffed animals in their precise order while Liam read another chapter of his science fiction novel. He tucked them in, kissed their foreheads, and promised tomorrow would be just like always: stable, secure, loved. Once the house was quiet, David stepped out onto the back porch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. He thought about the trial, about Angela's note, about the battles won and those perhaps still to come. The wooden porch swing creaked softly as he sat down. In his pocket, he felt the small photo he always carried, taken the day Liam was born, with Chloe perched on the hospital bed, peering curiously at her new brother. Back then, he'd thought their family was complete, perfect. Now he understood that perfection wasn't in the picture-perfect moments, but in the messy, real ones. He pulled out his phone and opened his calendar, checking tomorrow's schedule. Liam's science project was due, Chloe needed her permission slip signed for the field trip, and he had a meeting with a client. The ordinary chaos of parenthood stretched before him, and he welcomed it. A soft breeze carried the scent of Mrs. Thompson's rose garden next door. David closed his eyes, feeling the tension of the past months finally begin to release. The system had tried to define him by its prejudices, but he had defined himself through his actions, his dedication, his love. Inside, he could hear the gentle hum of the house at night, the refrigerator's quiet purr, the tick of the hallway clock, the occasional creak of bed springs as his children settled into sleep. These were the sounds of home, of family, of victory. The stars wheeled overhead as David sat in peaceful contemplation. Angela's threat lingered at the edges of his mind, but it couldn't penetrate the core of certainty he'd found. He had fought not just against her, but against a system of assumptions and biases, and he had emerged stronger. Tomorrow would bring its challenges: homework struggles, teenage attitudes, the constant juggling of work and family. But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, David Miller knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He was a father, not just by biology but by choice, by action, by unwavering commitment. The court had confirmed what his children had always known. That love isn't about gender roles or societal expectations, but about showing up, day after day, with an open heart and steady presence. As midnight approached, David stood and took one last look at the stars. Inside, his children slept peacefully, their dreams protected by the knowledge that their father would always be there, would always fight for them, would always put them first. He smiled, thinking of the "World's Best Dad" banner hanging crookedly above the door. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't marked by gavels or legal documents, but by crayon-drawn letters and tiny handprints, by trust freely given and love unconditionally returned. David switched off the porch light and went inside, leaving the door unlocked for the morning paper. Tomorrow would be another day of packed lunches and morning rushes, of homework help and bedtime stories. And he wouldn't have it any other way. For in these ordinary moments, these simple acts of fatherhood, he had found his true victory, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of two children who never doubted, even when the world did, that their father would move heaven and earth to keep them safe, happy, and loved. The house settled into night's embrace, 3 hearts beating in peaceful synchrony, while outside, the stars kept their eternal watch over a family made stronger by the battles they had faced together.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.